You know, you look at 1949, 1950, 51, 52, 53, you know, basically everything regarding civil rights, any mass protest around civil rights was considered communist. All the civil rights groups that were not affiliated with the Communist Party actually backed off of their most aggressive advocacy because they did not want to be accused of being communist. I mean, the NAACP had to start putting out lawn signs that said NAACP, not communist, in different places because anything affiliated with civil rights was allegedly affiliated with communism, and certainly anything that was affiliated with mass protest. And it set back the struggle for civil rights maybe 10 years, quite frankly. If you look at where you were in 1945 and look at 1955 when the Montgomery bus boycott happened, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, 45 to let's say 48 was a time of great explosion of civil rights activity that was all completely, basically totally cut off because of the impact of McCarthyism in the broader scheme of the country. So many of the greatest activists, W.B. Du Bois, you know, at that time was the greatest living intellectual in America, had his entire career destroyed. Paul Robeson, the most famous entertainer on the globe at that time, had his career completely and totally destroyed and his health destroyed along with it, and driven into essentially obscurity. I mean, I could go on and on and on about, you know, individuals who's, you know, just were not able to do anything because they were deemed to be quote unquote communists, and some were and some weren't, but it wasn't illegal for them to be, quite frankly. It was 100% legal if they wanted to be a communist or a Marxist and a member of the Communist Party USA. I mean, even Martin Luther King Jr., of course, was heavily attacked and red baited. Now the times had changed and they weren't able to succeed, but he had to also himself take some bold stands against red baiting in terms of the attempts to control his staff and other things like that. So ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a long script, and that labor radicalism, civil rights are always associated with these red scares. And the most radical people who want the best wages and the best working conditions for workers, who want the quickest and most substantive end to racism in America, who want basically the fairest possible society where everyone has the best possible chance to live and thrive the best they can, become the first victims of these kind of attacks. And that's exactly what's happening here. And it's, you know, the New York Times, these liberals are just as complicit. I mean, you know, Trump is open about it. You know, he's making these crazy claims about communism and Marxism that are totally fake and totally scurrilous. And the Republicans are obviously on a hardcore McCarthyite witch hunt. But these liberals and the people in the New York Times, in a way, are just as bad, because they're trying to act like they actually care about progressive issues when you read the New York Times, you know, editorial page. But at the end of the day, you know, they're also just as complicit with these sorts of politics that prevent that kind of you know, substantive change from coming to the country.
The other aspect of the McCarthyism is that it taints and shuts people's brains down. So you're not even supposed to look at what someone's saying because they're just persona non grata. They are just tainted with this brush. They are Russian agents or Chinese agents, or they sympathize with those countries. They're being paid by them, or they've been like, their brains have been scrambled and infected by them. And the reason that that's so dangerous is because then people really don't look at what someone's saying, or they look at anything that someone's saying as clearly the result of them being paid off by someone.
Yeah, I mean, you know, famed New York Times journalist David Halberstam wrote the famous book, The Best and the Brightest, about the Vietnam War. And this is basically the exact point he made, is what you just said, is that the impact of McCarthyism on eliminating anybody who actually knew anything about Asia essentially set the stage that the only people making policy were these hardcore Cold Warriors who were going to continue the Vietnam War, even when they knew it couldn't succeed, because it wasn't about the Vietnam War succeeding. It was about essentially just bleeding out the Soviets and waging a war for the sort of containment for containment's sake. But they talk about how many, he talks about in the book, and it's a fantastic book, and I encourage everyone to read it, The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam, about how basically the people making policy knew nothing about what was going on and were just making decisions essentially just on vibes because they hated communism and they thought this was going to work. And anyone who could have told them, well, this is definitely not going to work and it's actually going to maybe backfire on you in a major way, had already been written out of the picture 10, 15, 20 years before, because they were deemed to be sympathetic to communism, the so-called China hands. And let's remember, when we talk about China, that this was the proximate issue with McCarthyism was the who lost China debate after the Chinese Revolution in 1949. And it immediately gets blamed on the so-called China hands, who were a range of individuals who were working inside and outside the State Department, who become very influential because they had long experience inside of China. And they were making the point in the policy discussion that Chiang Kai-shek was a renegade, a gangster, who had no desire to actually improve the lives of the Chinese people, and that his government was bound to collapse, and the communists were guaranteed to win because the policies of the Communist Party of China were broadly popular amongst the hundreds of millions of peasants who wanted the land to be redistributed, the workers who wanted wealth to be redistributed and wanted a say in how their own factories were won, and the broad Chinese people who were tired of the country having been humiliated and divided for 100 years, and just completely destroyed by colonialism and the so-called open door policy. And they wanted a country that would unite and be strong also against the outside. And the only people who brought that were the communists. And the communists were saying to America, starting in 1944, you can look at this, listen, we want to work with America. We maybe don't agree on everything, but we feel we can have a good relationship here. Yes, we have a good relationship with the Soviet Union, but we have our own minds. We're our own people. No reason why we can't work together. We're working pretty well together now during World War II. The so-called service mission there goes to Yan'an and meets with them. With Mao Zedong and the leadership there. So they're saying, we want to work with you. We're trying to do what we want to do. Like, what's going on? Let's come together here. You have people like Liu Liang Mo, who was writing in the black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, representing the Chinese Communist movement, talking about how China, shared a vision with many black Americans to try to end colonialism, to end racism, and that perhaps the progressive movements of the two countries working together could have a big impact on the majority of the world that had been trapped in colonialism for so long, and that it could have a positive impact on Jim Crow in America. I mean, all these things that were good. But ultimately, because of the issue of the U.S. feeling that, quote unquote, losing China was a sign that the so-called American century, which was the U.S. plan that really started to be developed in 1943 to make sure that they could dominate in the place of the former European colonial powers, that could be cut short by a powerful Chinese communist movement. So they concocted this witch hunt, this McCarthyite nonsense to destroy anyone who had raised the alarm correctly and had argued for a logical position, and then make sure that they had no influence over how to move forward in terms of the policies that would happen at that time, and to make sure that only the most warmongering, imperialist voices would be able to have any purchase hold in the establishment conversation. But again, it started right there in a similar way with China. So there's a lot of connections between the past and the contemporary reality when we look at this, and we look at, again, what was lost in McCarthyism. You look at this issue that we started the show with, the UAW and the workers who were fighting for their own basic rights. The whole reason the labor movement was totally defanged was McCarthyism. The most militant and the most radical unions, the most radical union leaders, the most radical rank and file leaders, and the most radical organizers were all thrown out of the labor movement on the purpose of being communists, which meant the only people who were left, no disrespect here to the dead, were people like Walter Reuther, who ultimately what they wanted to do is make a deal with the bosses that was not ultimately good for the workers, and to keep that deal going, to have labor peace so that the system could be stable, because they also hated communism, and they felt better to let their own workers not get what they truly deserve than to have too much labor radicalism. So the people who would really fight, the people in the labor movement who were against racism, who were against the use of the seniority system to keep black people out of the trades, they were all kicked out. This is the reality of what was happening. The people who were willing to go to the mat for people like Willie McGee, the Martinsville 7, I believe it was, the Trenton 6, these people who were facing these legal lynch mobs in the wake of World War II from these Jim Crow forces who wanted to reinstall on top of the country this Jim Crow fascist dictatorship that had started to break apart a little during World War II. They were thrown out, and they said anyone who's for civil rights is a communist. So ultimately, it's very dangerous, and you can see it now in climate change. That right now they're trying to do anything possible to stop people who are against nuclear war, who want to take aggressive action on climate change, from saying anything whatsoever, because they know that the only way to do those things is, in course, for there to be collaboration, not confrontation between China and America. And the reality is no matter what the Biden administration says, they're lying. They say that they're not for confrontation. Their policy is directly confrontational. And I think that we have to acknowledge that. Why are the Marines making all these preparations to survive a nuclear first or second strike in terms of their forward deployments inside of Asia? Why is the United States putting aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Strait? Why are we sending aircraft carriers to Vietnam? Why are we getting involved in the issue of a Coast Guard vessel in the Philippines vis-a-vis China? Why is it that we send a nuclear submarine with nuclear missiles to dock in South Korea? Why are we pushing the rearmament of all of these various countries in the region? Why have we created this absurd AUKUS so-called alliance where Australia is now spending all of its money to buy nuclear submarines from America to push a war against China? Why are we cultivating hatred between India and China as opposed to hoping that the two countries can work together and try to mediate? I mean, every single thing about the US strategy in Asia is 100% aggressive, 100% offensive, 100% aimed at containing China. The fact that they're trying to destroy all of China's major industries and even Americans. I mean, the reason why most of these American funds are invested in China and why a lot of your retirement, whoever's out there with these 401ks, is sitting on China is because the investment funds can't even make their returns unless they invest in China. So America's so great, but the 401ks got to invest in China in order to make sure that they can pay out to old people the money that they've paid in over all this time. I mean, that should tell you something, but they're trying to destroy that too by stopping the investments in China. So they're trying to destroy everything related to this. And then they say, oh, but we're not for confrontation. And then they wonder why you can't get collaboration. Oh, they won't return our phone calls. Who knew? Or why when John Kerry goes over there, nothing really happens. So ultimately, if we want to save the planet, if we want to not have a nuclear war, if we want to address hunger and poverty, the US and China are going to have to collaborate. And if they don't collaborate, the world's going to be headed in a very negative direction. But unfortunately, both parties in Congress, everyone in the White House, the vast majority of these shills in the mainstream media, they don't care about any of that. They just want to live in this space, in this moment of U.S. unipolar dominance, and they're fiddling while Rome burns. They're just like Emperor Nero, who I'm sure had many hangers on himself, who, as Rome was burning, said, no, Emperor, it's not burning. Let's just keep playing the violin.